Okay.
Hey, everybody, how
Oh,
are you doing? We finally made it. I'm Dr. Gail, and this is Barbara Lamb, and we were having some major difficulties, but we finally made it. So, all right.
woohoo.
Well, this is everybody. If you don't know, this is Barbara Lamb, and I'm going to give a little bit of her background, and I'm reading it. So, she is a crop circle researcher, a lecturer, an author, a psychotherapist, a hypnotherapist, a past life regression therapist, an ET researcher, and an experiencer. She's a licensed psychologist therapist, and she has been featured on several channels, which has been Ancient Aliens, Gaia, Netflix, History Channel, and has had many, many awards. Barbara, do you have something else going on in your background? Did you turn your phone off? I hear a little feedback.
I did turn it off.
Okay, you turned your phone. Okay, I
Just
just a
another
little.
little technical glitch.
I mean, Bella, did I miss anything, Barbara? There's so much we could just go on and on and on about all your accolades and things that you've done in your past. And you've been on this channel several times, which I appreciate. And I've also had several regressions with you, which have been great. And
Good.
so, why don't we start off talking a little bit about you and your regression therapy? Since this channel is more about the ETs, the aliens, our galactic friends, um, these people probably be more interested in what you do on your regression therapies and what the process is. Because the first time I did it, I was scared. I thought
Oh,
um,
yeah.
I would not be in control. So if you could help them kind of ease their mind on some of that things and tell them exactly
Oh,
what the process is.
yes. Well, I think for many people, it's sort of seems like a mysterious process to do a regression. It's really a very simple matter, at least from my point of view. The person comes in to me with an issue, a question, something they've been wondering about, sometimes for many years, and we discuss what that focus is for the regression, their question, their thing they're wondering about, and then the person lies down, and I take about 15 minutes or so to guide the person in a nice state of deep relaxation. And so uh, the person is just lying there getting more and more relaxed, and I encourage them to let go of anything going on in their life currently, and just be open and receptive. And I suggest that there are various aspects of their mind that are helping them. Uh, One of them is the subconscious part of the mind. And it turns out that the subconscious part of the mind records absolutely every moment of our life experience. And it records that information. So if the person goes into a nice state of relaxation, which we call hypnosis, um, that the subconscious part of the mind can be accessed very easily and bring up whatever the person wants to know about that has been repressed into the subconscious part of the mind. So, in other words, in terms of extraterrestrial encounters that people have had, that they usually, when the encounter is happening, they usually remember only the very first few moments of the experience of being approached by the other beings or whatever is happening. In some cases, they experience just being sort of lifted up, just sort of raised right up through the ceiling if they're inside, or just up in the air if they're outside. But usually the person has remembered only the first couple of seconds or few seconds of that experience. And then they're out of conscious awareness, which the beings seem to create for the person. And so they have the whole experience in which they've not been consciously aware. However, as I was saying, the subconscious part of the person's mind is making note of it, is actually recording it very accurately, moment by moment, whatever it is that's going on that the person is not aware of. And so, in this state of relaxation, in the regression, the subconscious mind just brings forth all of that material that it had recorded for that incident. And so what happens is that it comes into the person's awareness just moment by moment by moment. It's not like looking back to the past as we can do with our conscious mind and, and kind of remember it in a linear fashion as if, oh yeah, then I went there and then that happened and then that other thing happened. It's not like that. What occurs in the regression is that the person is aware of the very first moments of that experience. For instance, they might have been on that occasion lying in bed at night sleeping. That's a very typical thing that happens. And they're aware of waking up, and I say, what are you aware of? Oh, well, it just seems like there's a presence in the room. It feels like there's somebody here. And I will say, okay, well, do you see anything? And then they'll say, oh, yeah, over there to my right, there's a being standing there. And I say, oh, well, what do you see about that being? And that they'll describe the being. And then I say, and what's happening now? And then they'll say, I mean, I'm just giving a typical example here. Then they will say, oh, now the being is right over by my bed. Oh, and I'm being lifted up somehow. I'm being floated up. I'm not being touched, but I'm being floated up and across the room. And then usually they don't remember anything after that. So that's how the actual regression material begins, at the very beginning of the experience that they had maybe years ago, maybe decades ago, maybe in childhood even. And so we just go moment by moment by moment. And I just keep saying, okay, what are you aware of now? And that person will describe, oh, I'm going through the wall and amazing, it doesn't hurt at all. And now we're out in the air, we're headed up in the sky. And oh, now I seem to be inside something, which turns out to be the UFO. And so that's how we do it. They say, well, what do you notice inside? And they'll say, oh, well, I'm in a corridor and there's sort of dim light, but I can see that there are rooms off the corridor. And I say, well, describe the corridor. And they'll say, oh, well, it kind of seems to form a big curve. And we're walking around. I say, well, how are you walking? Well, I'm not really walking. I'm upright, but I'm sort of being floated. And I say, is anybody with you? Yes, that strange one who came into my room, this one is guiding me. Oh, now we're going into one of the rooms. Oh, it's very, very bright, very lighted. But I can't see any lamps or ceiling lights. It's just very bright. And I'll say, okay, you're doing fine. You just keep on going. Notice what happens next. Oh, well, I'm looking at a table, kind of like a doctor's table, a medical table. And oh, now I'm on that table. And I'll say, what position are you in? I'm lying down. And for some reason, I can't move, but I'm lying here on this table and all this bright light. And I'll say, do you notice anybody else there by any chance? And they say, oh, yeah, there's a group of, well, I don't know what they are. I guess they're beings. They're not really people, but they're upright like people. And I'll have them describe them. Those are the extraterrestrials. And so that's how the process goes. We just keep going moment by moment of the person's experience with as many details as possible. And I am always asking one question after the other to bring out more detail. The more questions I ask, the more the person is aware of seeing around them. And we get a sense of uh, what's happening to the person very often, but not always. But very often in these encounters, there's some sort of physical examination going on. And if I ask the person, would you like to know what they're doing and why? And the person will usually say, yes, I would like to know what's happening to me. And I'll say, well, you can ask them. You can ask them out loud with your words, or you can just ask the question in your mind, and they'll pick it up because they're very telepathic. And so the person asks the question, usually just in his or her mind, and the beings answer. I have found that consistently to be true, that the beings will explain. And usually it amounts to the fact that they are checking the person physically to see how all the systems of their bodies are doing. And wonderfully, if there is something going wrong, like in one organ of the body, for instance, or maybe the circulatory system, or whatever the problem is, they will mention that specifically to the person. And there are two things that happen then. One is that they will go ahead and heal whatever they have detected is malfunctioning. And there are many, many cases of extraterrestrials healing people of all kinds of problems that the people might have. And I think that that is absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
And the healing lasts. I mean, they are healed forever of whatever that particular problem was. And then in some cases, I've noticed, instead of going ahead and healing the person, the beings say, we have detected a problem in your, let's say, as an example, your pancreas, and it is not functioning properly. So we suggest that when you're home again, you go to your own doctor and ask him to check your pancreas, because we know, maybe he doesn't know yet, but we know that you do have a malfunction there in that particular organ. And so that's helpful for the person too. But even more miraculously, I think, is when they just go right ahead and heal it themselves. So people whom I know and have worked with have been healed from a tremendous number of different kinds of malfunctions in their bodies. And sometimes, by the way, uh, people are healed right there in their own bed at home. The beings come and do the healing there. And the very first woman I ever regressed to an extraterrestrial encounter, and we did several regrets, about 6 regressions. And in one of them, the encounter with the beings happened when she had a very, very painful earache. And what she was aware of one night in bed with this earache is that she was being rolled over from her back onto her side with the affected ear facing upwards. And then she was aware that there was some feelings in her, somebody, little, like little fingers moving around in her ear. It didn't hurt, but she was curious, and she was able to move her eyes around to the side to see that there were 3 very tall, very thin, very white, totally white beings with long fingers, and that they were doing something to her ear, obviously. And then she kind of went out of consciousness for the rest of the night. And when she woke up in the morning, there was no pain in her ear. It was completely and forever healed by those beings having come to do that healing when she was in her bed at night. So that sort of thing happens. I know of many accounts of people who've been healed of something, usually in bed at night or with other people. They're healed when they're on the ship, the UFO, with the beings. So that's wonderful. Anyway, to go back to the process of regression, um, the person will pick up the details and have a little conversation, sometimes even with the beings once they have asked. Um, in all cases that I have worked with, when the person is on a medical table, the beings are not volunteering information about what they're doing. But if the person asks, they will definitely give an answer. And so far, the answers always seem to be totally accurate for what's really happening inside the body of that person. But then the conversations sometimes between the beings and the person uh, go on a bit more. And miraculously, I was so surprised the first time this happened, and it's happened many times, that the beings, once they're talking to the person they've taken for this experience, the beings then somehow, I cannot explain it, but somehow they know that right now this person is being regressed and that I am regressing that person. So they turn their attention to me. They say, "Now, Barbara, we want to talk to you." Now, I mean, I think that that is just outstanding and miraculous. And so they've said over the years, with person after person, they've said many things to me, mostly giving thanks and appreciation for the fact that I am helping this person to know what she has been experiencing with these beings. And sometimes they'll go a little bit further and they'll say, "We appreciate your helping this person to know." It does help the person to know what's happened, and particularly when it's something that maybe they've wondered about. And we also appreciate you sharing information about this in public, like I'm doing right now.
Right.
So they say we want humans to know about us, that humans have been so isolated in the sense of their awareness, isolated in the universe, not even realizing that there are many other beings, and not realizing that anybody can have contact with some of these beings. And we're very pleased that you're helping humanity to know about this. It's very important. It's very real. It's very pervasive. So thank you for what you're doing. And then on one occasion, a few months ago, I was absolutely amazed that when they were talking to me during a regression about somebody else's experience, that they turned their attention to me and they said, "Barbara, we want to acknowledge your very keen interest in Easter Island, and in particular the Moai statues." And they went on for several minutes about that, knowing somehow that when I was a child, probably about age 6, I think, that I saw my first picture of one of the Moai statues on Easter Island in a Life magazine. And that even as a child, I immediately knew that, oh, those weren't done by people. They were done by somebody else. Now, at age 6, I had no possible idea, thought, awareness of extraterrestrial beings. But somehow, as a child, I knew that about the statues on Easter Island. And then in 2010 and again in 2011, I went to Easter Island those 2 years and experienced the statues as being conscious,
Oh, wow.
which I did not have that word in my mind as a child, but I so I said, people think these are statues, but they're alive. They're alive and they're thinking and they're aware. And then when I went to Easter Island decades later, many decades later, and encountered the statues themselves, I had that total feeling, not that they were alive, but that they were conscious and somehow aware. And it didn't make logical sense, but that's what I kept feeling. And so I kept talking to them, both of those trips to Easter Island, and felt almost like I had a relationship with them. Anyway, these beings in that regression knew all of that.
Wow.
So that's one of the examples of why I have said so frequently that, oh, these beings know so much more about us than we know about them.
Yeah.
And they were very interested in us, our human species. So it's really outstanding to me that we can, to some extent, really have a relationship with them. And of course, some people keep seeing the same beings over and over again through many years of their lives, usually from a very, very early age. And so they do actually develop sort of a relationship with them.
Right.
And a person could go through decades of life without even knowing that they're having any of these experiences. There may have been some clues along the way that was, sort of peculiar happenings or, unusual markings that they wake up and see on their skin and so forth, but different, or they've had missing time experiences, but they may not know for many decades or maybe forever in some cases that they're actually having encounters with these beings. Now,
Well,
with some people, uh, they've had many encounters that we know about because of the regression work. And each time, each encounter is with a different being or group of beings, different species. And yet, with some people, each time they have an encounter, it's with the very same being. There might be other beings around the periphery, but that they seem to have an ongoing, lifelong relationship with a particular being. And it seems like those people who have the ongoing relationship with one particular being, that they are happier about being involved in that whole phenomenon rather than having different beings coming to them each time and doing different procedures with them. So, anyway, there's a lot to learn about this phenomenon and the people who experience them. So, anyway, just to go back to the regression process, since you asked that. So, we go moment by moment through whatever the experience has been, whether they're on a medical table or whether they're standing upright and being taught certain things by the extraterrestrials. Many people, for instance, are taught psychic skills that they had not known before, but they're taught psychic skills by the beings, a whole variety of psychic skills. And the person usually appreciates that. Wow, now I'm clairvoyant, or now I'm clairsentient. I never was before. And they're taught healing skills too, taught how to heal other people and other life forms here on Earth, a skill that they had never had before or never knew that they had. And so there are definitely benefits that many people feel that they come back with, having been taught by these beings.
Well,
So,
I'll ask you though, even in the beginning, like when I was going to do the regression, you said have 3 questions ready. And also, the thing I was worried about was I was going to be totally out. You can control everything, but I wasn't. I was very aware of my surroundings and what was going on, what was happening in life, and I wasn't being totally controlled by you or the beings, ETs. And I think that's a misconception a lot of people have, is you're going to have them over here barking like a dog or having them doing something else that they're not aware of, but you are aware of every moment of what's going on.
when you're in the regression, when you're reliving it, whereas when you are not in a regression, you're not reliving it, it may be a complete blank.
Right.
I mean, did you find, for instance, Dr. Gale, that in the regression, you learned things that you would not have guessed?
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm one of those people that didn't know I was had a relationship with them until decades later. When you regressed me, found out I was going up since an infant in my first memory. And you brought me into all these details about the rooms I was in, about everybody who was around me, how the process, you went in, you pulled out every detail of that. And I probably was only weeks old that I was going up there, started going up there. And I'd never known that. My first memory had been when I was like 9 or 10, but you brought me all the way back to infancy, and very,
Yes.
very, very, very detailed that I'd have never been able to bring up.
Right. It's really fascinating, isn't it? And I think it's wonderful that we can bring those things up if we want to.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
yes, and you do have full control. Yes.
Yes, yes. Right. And in the regression, nothing is forced upon you. I just simply ask you what you're aware of. I'm not putting in any suggestions. I
No.
just ask you. And that's why I hear so many amazing things that I never would have thought of myself. Yeah. It's very important that the person conducting the regression is totally neutral, giving no leading suggestions, just asking questions and letting it completely come from the person who's being regressed. Then it's much, much more authentic. And
Right.
and isn't it interesting too that you can, as you know, because you did it, that you can be regressed to infancy,
Mm-hmm.
even before you were able to talk
Right.
or actually embody here on Earth. And yet, the good old subconscious part of the mind is recording all of that so that you can, in that nice, relaxed state, access all the details. I
Right.
think it's very fortunate that we can.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think Diane G's wanting to know, or somebody was wanting to know, if you did other kind of regressions, which you do. You do all kinds of regressions. It's
Yes.
just we're just talking about the extraterrestrials here on this channel.
Right. Well, I began learning regression therapy, being trained in that through the Association for Past Life Research and Therapies, a wonderful group which was very active in the 1980s and mostly through the 1990s. And unfortunately, they had to discontinue being for financial reasons. But anyway, I had 5 years of training with them in the 1980s, training in past life regression therapy. So that's how I got into the regression therapy work. And then it wasn't until 1991 that somebody came to me for a different reason, for uh, finding out about these peculiar beings who would show up in her room sometimes at night and just terrify the lights out of her. And they never did, we discovered, do anything bad. In fact, if anything, they did things that were helpful to her, but she didn't know that consciously and was just absolutely stopped in life. She dropped out of college and dropped out of her part-time job and wouldn't leave her home, and would insisted on sleeping between her mother and father in bed at night. And yet those encounters still happened. So what is very typical is that if a person a person who experiences these encounters, if the person is sleeping in bed with somebody else, a spouse or whatever, or a sibling sometimes in childhood, or even somebody sleeping in the same room in a different bed, that person is always what we call switched off. In other words, they are made by the beings to be completely unaware of the experience happening to the one who's having the experience. In other words, they seem to be in a very, very deep state of sleep. So the person who's being visited, if there are others in the room like that, the person, even if the person could call out and move, which they usually can't from the very first moments that the beings are there, but even if they could, the person would not be able to be aroused, awakened, because they're in such a deep state of not being conscious. So that's a very typical thing. And that can even happen in groups of people.
Right.
I mean, I have several cases I've worked with when the person being affected, being taken, is actually right there in a group of people, like in a party in one situation. With another person, the person was in a big office room of a big city building, each person working in his or her own cubicle. And so a very public situation in both cases, the party and the office building. And beings came and switched everybody off, including the one who was going to be taken, and everybody else in the room vicinity. And then the person was taken and had whole experience for an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours maybe, and then brought back again. And once the beings had brought the person back and left the area, then everybody suddenly became sort of awake and aware and alert again. And
what happened to that last 2 hours?
yeah, exactly. Yes, that's right. And like in the office building, this happened around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, this visit for the one person. Everybody else was switched off, and so was the one person. And then when the person was brought back and the beings left and went back to the elevator and left the building, and then everybody suddenly was turned on. And eventually one person after the other said, "How did the afternoon go so quickly? It was only around 3 o'clock, but now it's 5 o'clock and it's dark. I mean, what happened?" And then somebody else would hear that from their cubicle and say, "Yeah, I don't understand why the time could fly so fast without my being aware of it. I haven't accomplished anything." So, these things are mysterious. And, people can live with that sort of anomaly um, for years and years and years and years, and maybe never have any awareness of what really had happened during that time. But fortunately for the person who did have the experience, if that person has a regression to that incident of losing those 2 hours of time that particular day, then that person can know. All the other person in the office wouldn't know probably, but unless the person affected had shared that with everybody later on. But I'm sure usually that probably doesn't happen.
Yeah.
At
Well,
least,
actually, I want to go back to what Dolores Cannon wrote in her book, the book, The Custodians, the two chapters she wrote about you when your name was Bonnie because you weren't out about your own experiences. And
I had
Dolores
come out.
regressed you back. You're out now. And Dolores regressed you back to find out what happened on that night that you were driving down 101 in California and you did how many regressions did she do to get all the information out of you
She
on that?
did two.
It took two. Okay.
Yeah.
And
Uh,
yeah, your name was Bonnie at that time.
yeah.
And the chapter's name, which was funny, is Therapy for Therapist. What I thought was a great name, Therapy for Therapist. And she was writing about you.
Right. She was. Yes. This was back in 1997 when I had the experience. And about 3 weeks later, I was at a conference with Dolores Cannon as fellow speaker. And I just happened to mention this to her in a personal conversation that, wow, I had a really peculiar thing happen about 3 weeks ago. And I mentioned a couple of the details, and she said, "Oh, Barbara, you need a regression." And I said, "I know, I've been hoping to get one." And she said, "Well, I'll regress you right at the end of the conference." So that was really wonderful. And we did. So I'll describe the experience. And by the way, it was a good experience, baffling, of course, uh, at first, but turned out to be a perfectly good experience that I'm happy to have had. But of course, I didn't know that until I had the regression. I knew something had happened, but I didn't know what, and I didn't know how I would feel about it. Um, okay, so it was a Friday night, and I was driving from the Santa Barbara, California area, which is on the coast, Pacific coast, driving down the 101 freeway. And I left the venue where I had been for a lecture in Santa Barbara. I had left it exactly midnight. I noticed on the clock in my car, thinking, oh, okay, well, it takes me about 2.5 hours to get to my home. So I'll get there probably around 2:30 in the morning. And anyway, I locked the doors of the car with the central locking system and think, okay, that's good. I'm safe. I like to drive with a locked car, especially at nighttime and alone. So I set out down the freeway. And after a few minutes, I noticed that, oh, that's really strange. There's no other traffic on the freeway, no headlights coming toward me, no taillights um, in, in front of me, uh, and nothing, no headlights shining in back of me. I must be alone on the freeway. That's odd. And then I saw, a few minutes later, I saw like a totally round flash of light to my right, which was over the ocean, which was right nearby. And it just lasted for 1 second, just this flat, perfectly round, like a huge sphere of light with a slightly greenish tinge to the edge of it. And I thought, well, that's weird. I wonder what that is. It couldn't be lightning because lightning doesn't have a particularly round shape like that. And then driving a little further, I noticed that there was some light behind the hills over to my left. And I thought, well, that's weird too, because I know that I know this territory well. I've driven it many, many times. And I know that there are no towns over there. There would be no streetlights or anything. So what could that big arc of light be, which was the same color exactly as that big flash of light, that spherical shape over the ocean? And then I drove further and noticed that ahead of me was what I thought was a big silver trailer truck, parked partly on the freeway and partly off. And it had lights around the bottom of it. And as I approached it, I was assuming it was a regular uh, delivery truck, a big super truck, and that it must have had a flat tire, and they must have put flares. That's what the light was on the street, and then I could see people walking around the back end of that huge vehicle. And I assumed, oh, they've just gotten out, put down flares, and they're going to change a tire. You know, innocent,
Yeah.
perfectly okay, normal, I thought. And then when I got to the end, the front end of the truck, suddenly, in 1 second, there was a big flash of very bright light, sort of peachy pink colored light, and some sort of like a strip of something going horizontally across my windshield, and and in that very same second, the something stretched across it, and a crack in my windshield, right in front of my face, in front of the driver's seat, and it was kind of a roundish crack, looking like a spider web, and yet it had no hole in it, as it might have if a rock had flung up from the freeway and struck the windshield. So here was this crack in the windshield, the light, this sort of strap or something strung across it. And then it happened that my car and I, my good old Subaru wagon, and I were being lifted up in what seemed to be a diagonal beam of light going up into the sky. And I was holding onto the steering wheel and, as if still driving it, but the motor wasn't on anymore. But that didn't matter because we were going up in the air into the dark sky. And then the whole vehicle that I was in just sort of lifted up and then placed on the floor of some sort of interior up in the sky. And it looked to me like a big plain room, kind of oval shaped, it seemed, from my perspective in the driver's seat. My motor was still off. Anyway, there were the car and I sitting on the floor of this empty room, and suddenly, very quickly, a whole group of little beings came rushing toward the car, and they climbed up on the hood and on the top roof of the car and looking in all of the windows all around, the back windows, the side windows, the windshield. One was even on the roof looking down, upside down, through the windshield of the car. And they just looked so cute to me and so funny because they were so curious. These little guys are probably about 3 or 3.5 feet tall. I was guessing, had great big eyes, big sort of shiny eyes, and they no hair. They obviously were not humans. These were not human children, although they were the size of young children. Anyway, they were very curious, and even though my doors were locked, I remember locking them. they got in the front seat, the passenger seat. They somehow just opened it up and then scooted in, two of them, and sat right on top of my purse and my little peppermint candies I had out on that seat in case I should need to have a little help in staying awake on the drive. And then two others opened the driver's door, and all of these beings looked exactly the same. And it's not that they had expressions on their faces really, but I guess it was with these big eyes that they had. They just looked very, very curious. And so the two that opened the driver's door, somehow just sort of slid me out, and then they started walking me across the room toward a door that I could see was there. And I wasn't really walking, I wasn't really touching the floor, although I was upright in walking position. But they, without actually touching my body, they were somehow lifting me and moving me along upright, floating me along. And every once in a while, I would tip down one foot, to see how far I was from the floor, like you might do in a swimming pool. It
Yeah.
reminded me of that. And yes, indeed, I was, a couple of inches above the floor, being just floated along vertically like that, and through the door. And this whole group of beings seemed to be following me and around me. And we went into that next room. And what I saw in the room seemed to be a very plain room, but it did have in the middle of it kind of a platform. Looked like it was about 1 foot high, and then a big column coming up from the platform to the ceiling. And way up there on the column, it looked like there was a metal helmet type of thing with some holes in it. Metal, helmet shaped. And I didn't think too much about that, but thought that's curious. And they led me up on the platform and seated me in a chair that was there, a very upright, straight, hard chair. And they even did some sort of buckle across me, my abdomen. So I was secure in that chair. And then they brought down that helmet sort of thing down to my head and fitted it around my head. Particularly, I remember pressing it in around the temples so it would be securely touching my head, like a cap or a helmet, not over my face. And then they formed a circle around me in the front. So I was looking like a big semicircle of all these little beings. I'd say there, must have been 20 or 30, maybe even 40 of them, all looking exactly the same, looking up at me sitting in that chair with that helmet on. And then there seemed to be a current of some sort coming through the helmet, through my head, and also through my body to some extent, but especially in my head. I had no idea what this was. So it felt kind of like an electric current, but it didn't hurt. And I had the sense that as mysterious as this was, it probably wasn't really harming me. I just couldn't imagine what it was for. And so I was looking at these little beings and thinking, oh my goodness, they are just so adorable and cute and curious, especially curious, looking at me, and I was looking at them and thinking, wow, this is absolutely amazing. Everywhere I look around me are these little beings down there. And then I noticed that behind these beings, there was a very tall white being, very different than these little ones, totally different species, and very white. He had white clothing on, maybe a robe, I'm not sure. I couldn't see down to his feet because these little beings were in the way. Anyway, he had big black eyes that kind of went down like this. They were not wraparound eyes, but much bigger, totally black eyes, and the white skin and the white clothes, no hair. And anyway, when he saw that I saw him, he said, "Ah, Barbara." So he seemed to know who I was, even though I didn't know who he was. And he said, good. You're probably wondering what is happening. And I was, because of that current. And he said, it's nothing to be concerned about. We are not harming you in any way. We are just making a copy of what's in your brain about people's experiences with those of us like us and others. In other words, extraterrestrials. He didn't use that word. And we just want to know what you know about other people's experiences with the beings that were from somewhere else. And then Dolores, conducting the regression, chimed right in and said, "Barbara, ask him what they do with that information that they're taking from your brain." And so I asked him, and he said, "We're just making a copy of that information. We're not removing it from your brain. You will retain that yourself, but we're just making a copy of it." And Dolores chimed in and said, "Barbara, ask him what do they do with that information?" And Dolores was such a wonderful researcher and got so much information from the regressions that she did. So this was typical. I wasn't surprised that she was wanting to get more information. And the being said, "Well, we broadcast this information that we're taking from her brain." And then Dolores said, "Well, who listens? Barbara, ask him who listens to it." And he said, anyone from somewhere else who is in the area and wants to know that information, they tune into that channel. We have our own channel, like you people have television and radio channels. We have channels too. And so anybody who's interested in that can just tune into it. And if they're not interested, they don't. And she asked another question or two. And then he said, "She doesn't need to ask questions through you, Barbara. I will hear the questions and answer them directly." So that's what the rest of that session was, that I was just sitting there with his helmet on and the current flowing through it and the little beings watching me. And Dolores asking questions, which he answered directly to her, didn't have to go through me. And well, actually, no, I have to correct what I just said. He could hear her asking questions, but he answered them to me and I relayed them to her. In other words, she was not in that situation herself. She was on the outside guiding it. And so she could not hear him directly herself. But anyway, I could pass whatever he said along to her. So she got the information she wanted. And that information went far and wide. It talked a lot about his species of beings. He didn't give a name for the species that I remember, but he told a lot about their lives and even their reproductive systems and how they conduct things and any of the questions that Dolores asked. And then at the end of that session, we'd gone on for a couple of hours at that point. Dolores said, "Oh, I have to finish now." Her cassette tape that she was recording this on got filled up with our session, and she also had another commitment she had to get to. So he said, before we finished. He said, if you too would like to continue this and receive more information, just get together again and do what you did today, and I will be there asking any question you wish. So we thought that was really very nice. And we then planned to meet again for a second regression, which happened to be about 2.5 months later when she came to the Los Angeles area to do some workshops or lectures or something. And I met with her. This time we each had a long list of questions that we wanted to ask the beings. And I gave my list to her, and so she could remind me to ask them to the being. And so for another 2 hours or 2.5 hours, he gave more information. So we were very, very pleased and gratified, that he would consent to do this. It's mostly about his species, but a lot about other species and just life in space in general. And so Dolores took that material and then sort of gleaned it down, couldn't put down all the details, but wrote about that in the last 2 chapters of her book called The Custodians. And it was very fortunate, I think, for both of us that when I had met her 3 weeks earlier, over 2.5 months earlier, she was just about finishing writing that book called The Custodians. And so she was able to include 2 chapters, the last 2 chapters of that book, full of this encounter and this information. And instead of calling me Barbara, the therapist, she referred to me as Bonnie, the investigator, as the one who had had this experience. Because at that time, 1997, I was not really willing to let people know that I too had had an ET encounter experience. Since then, somewhere along the line, I started talking about it publicly and realized, oh, that's okay. I don't mind doing that, and have continued to since then. But it was a very, very interesting experience. And then I've had 3 other experiences with extraterrestrial beings, and they were very different beings and very different things occurring.
Yeah, we're going to do that for another show. We're already at an hour right now.
Oh,
so we can go on another show about your other experiences, because you've had so many of them. But I would like you to let people know how to get in touch with you if they want a regression therapy, and also your YouTube channel and your website. I've got it all in the description box, but if you could go ahead and just tell them what all that is, that information.
Sure, happy to. The website is BarbaraLambRegression.com. Barbara Lamb, which is LAMB, regression.com. And the YouTube channel is Barbara Lamb ET Regressions. And was there another one?
We got it.
We've got it.
It's in the description box if people want that information. It is there. So anyway, thanks everybody for being here. Thanks moderators for making it a safe place. And Barbara, thank you so much. And we'll bring you back for those other stories that you have. Okay. We just got the tip of the iceberg there. So
right.
Yeah. All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you later. Thank you.
And thank you.